Somewhere in the cold silence of space, far beyond the boundaries of the solar system, a research spacecraft drifted quietly. Its metallic hull reflected the faint light of distant stars, as if it were sailing across an endless ocean of darkness. On board was astrophysicist Alexei Voronov, a man who had dedicated his entire life to studying the most mysterious objects in the universe. In front of him, on the massive panoramic screen, hung an object that had fascinated scientists and writers for centuries: a black hole. It did not glow. It showed no obvious movement. It made no sound. And yet, something strange was happening around it. The light from distant stars bent unnaturally, as if passing through an invisible lens. Space itself appeared distorted, as though the very fabric of reality had been crumpled by an unseen hand. This was the event horizon, the boundary beyond which nothing, not even light, can return. Alexei watched it in silence. Humanity had been studying black holes for more than a century, but no one had ever approached one this closely. All knowledge came from mathematics, telescopes, and theoretical models. But now, he had the chance to see everything with his own eyes. The onboard computer quietly displayed the distance. Just over 3 million kilometers remained until the event horizon. By cosmic standards, that was incredibly close. Alexei activated the ship's log recorder. His voice sounded calm, although inside he felt a mixture of excitement and unease. He understood that what he was about to do had never been done before. The spacecraft slowly began moving closer. At first, nothing happened. The black hole still looked like a perfect patch of darkness in space. But the closer the ship moved, the stranger the surrounding view became. The stars around it began to distort. Their light stretched into arcs, then into long, curved streaks. Space seemed to transform into a giant mirror bending reality itself.
This phenomenon was called gravitational lensing. The gravity of the black hole was so powerful that it literally bent light. Alexei stared at the screen and felt a strange sensation. It was as if the universe itself was starting to break apart. Stars that were actually behind the black hole became visible along its edges, forming a glowing ring. Scientists call this the Einstein ring. The spacecraft continued its approach, and that was when the first real changes began. The clocks on the control panel started behaving strangely. At first, Alexei thought it was a system error, but after running diagnostics, it became clear that everything was working perfectly. Time itself was slowing down. According to Einstein's theory of general relativity, the stronger the gravity, the slower time flows. Near a black hole, this effect becomes enormous. For Alexei, time inside the ship was passing normally, but for an observer far away in space, everything would look very different. If someone were watching the spacecraft from a safe distance, they would see the ship moving slower and slower as it approached the black hole. Seconds would stretch. Minutes would begin to look almost eternal. From afar, it would appear as if the ship had nearly stopped right at the edge of the black hole. But inside, everything continued normally. The ship kept moving forward. Then the instruments detected another anomaly. The difference in gravitational pull between the front and the back of the spacecraft began to increase. This effect is known as tidal forces. Near a black hole, gravity changes so dramatically that one part of an object is pulled much more strongly than another. For planets, this can cause massive ocean tides. But near a black hole, the effect becomes far more terrifying. A human body falling toward a black hole would gradually begin to stretch. At first, only slightly, then more and more. Scientists even have a darkly humorous name for this process: spaghettification. Alexei looked at the sensor readings. The gravitational difference was increasing, but the spacecraft had been built specifically for this mission. Its structure was made from ultra-strong composite materials designed to withstand extreme stress. For now, everything remained under control. But ahead lay the most important boundary of all, the boundary no human had ever crossed: the event horizon. Scientifically speaking, it wasn't a wall or a surface.
It was simply the point of no return, the moment after which even light can no longer escape. Alexei stared into the black abyss ahead. Interestingly, he saw no physical boundary, no surface, no line marking where it began, only absolute darkness. Yet the instruments confirmed that it was very close. He knew that once the ship crossed the event horizon, no information would ever escape again. No signal, no radio transmission, no data. For the rest of the universe, his spacecraft would simply vanish, forever. Alexei took a deep breath. He had always dreamed of witnessing the edge of the universe, but now he was standing before something even more mysterious, the edge of reality itself. The spacecraft continued its descent, and when the distance to the event horizon shrank to only a few thousand kilometers, something strange happened. The stars around the black hole began to move. No, not just move. They began to rotate around it. Light twisted into spirals. Space itself seemed to transform into a giant cosmic whirlpool. This happened because the black hole itself was rotating. Such black holes are known as Kerr black holes. They don't just pull objects inward, they drag space itself along with them. This effect is called frame dragging, and now the spacecraft was beginning to feel it. The navigation systems struggled to maintain course, but the trajectory was slowly bending. The ship was being pulled into a cosmic vortex.
But the most astonishing sight lay ahead. For a brief moment, Alexei saw something almost impossible to describe. Light. But not ordinary light. It was the light of the entire universe, bent, distorted, and gathered around the black hole. He could see stars that were actually behind him. He could see galaxies millions of light years away. The gravity of the black hole was bending all that light into a massive, glowing ring. It looked as if the entire universe surrounded him on all sides. And ahead, there was only darkness. Absolute darkness. The boundary was now incredibly close. The spacecraft slowly approached the event horizon, and in that moment, Alexei realized something strange. From a scientific perspective, nothing dramatic should happen when crossing it. If the black hole is large enough, a person could cross the event horizon and not even notice. No flash, no wall, no sudden barrier. Just a moment after which returning becomes impossible. And that moment was approaching. With every second, with every kilometer. The universe around him was warping more and more, and ahead, there was only darkness. The spacecraft was approaching the point where the laws of physics begin to behave in ways humanity still barely understands. And in just a few moments, Alexei would become the first human in history to cross the boundary of a black hole. The distance to the event horizon continued to shrink. Inside the spacecraft, everything seemed calm. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the instruments glowed steadily on the control panel. To Alexei, nothing felt dramatically different. His heartbeat remained steady, his breathing calm. If not for the readings on the screens, he might have believed he was still drifting peacefully through ordinary space. But the universe outside the ship was changing in ways no human had ever witnessed before. The stars were no longer fixed points of light. They were bending, stretching, moving. Around the black hole, the light of distant galaxies curved into glowing arcs, forming a strange, luminous halo. It looked as if the entire sky had been twisted into a ring around the darkness ahead. This was gravitational lensing at its most extreme. The gravity of the black hole was so powerful that it bent the paths of photons themselves. Light that should have traveled straight across the universe was now being pulled into curved trajectories. Alexei could see stars that should have been hidden behind the black hole. He could even see parts of the galaxy that lay far behind his spacecraft. It felt as though the black hole was turning the universe into a warped mirror. For a moment, the view was almost beautiful. But beneath that beauty was something deeply unsettling. The instruments continued to record new anomalies. Time dilation was increasing rapidly. From Alexei's perspective, only minutes were passing. But according to the calculations, time far away in the universe was beginning to race forward at an extraordinary rate. Hours, days, possibly even years. To an outside observer, Alexei's spacecraft would appear to slow down more and more as it approached the black hole. Eventually, it would seem almost frozen at the edge. The light from the ship would become redder and dimmer, stretched by gravity. Then it would fade completely. From the outside, the ship would never actually be seen crossing the event horizon. It would simply disappear. But for Alexei, the experience was completely different. For him, the fall continued. The ship was now only a few hundred kilometers from the event horizon. The computer displayed a quiet warning. Event horizon, proximity critical. Alexei leaned forward slightly in his chair. The black circle ahead seemed larger now. It was no longer just a distant anomaly in space. It filled the forward window like a hole punched directly into reality. And yet there was still no surface, no barrier, no visible line separating the known universe from whatever lay beyond. Just darkness. A darkness so deep that it seemed to swallow every thought that approached it. The ship continued its descent. And then something strange happened. The universe outside the spacecraft began to change in a way that no telescope had ever captured. The stars began to move faster, not just drifting, racing. From Alexei's perspective, the distant galaxies appeared to accelerate across the sky. What he was seeing was the effect of extreme gravitational time dilation. The rest of the universe was moving forward in time far more quickly than he was. Thousands of kilometers above the event horizon, time had already begun to diverge dramatically. Entire years might now be passing outside the black hole, while only minutes passed inside the spacecraft. Alexei watched as the sky slowly shifted. Constellations changed shape. Stars moved from their ancient positions. It was as if he were watching the future unfold in fast forward. Civilizations might rise and fall out there. Stars might explode into supernovas. Galaxies might drift and collide, all while he continued falling. The realization was staggering. Approaching a black hole did not only mean traveling through space, it meant traveling through time. The ship moved closer. The event horizon was now only a few dozen kilometers away. Alexei looked at the readings one more time. Everything was stable. The structure of the spacecraft remained intact. The tidal forces were increasing, but not yet dangerously. That was the strange thing about supermassive black holes. Unlike smaller black holes, their tidal forces near the event horizon can actually be relatively gentle. In theory, a person could cross the horizon of a massive black hole without feeling anything unusual at that exact moment. And now Alexei was about to test that theory. The final kilometers passed quickly. The darkness filled the entire window. The glowing ring of warped starlight around it shimmered like a cosmic halo. Then the computer quietly announced, "Event horizon approach, final seconds." Alexei stared ahead. No one had ever seen what he was about to see. The entire scientific community had only equations. Now there would finally be an answer. 5 seconds. 4. 3. The ship continued forward without resistance. 2. The darkness seemed to deepen. 1. And then, nothing happened. No shockwave, no flash, no sudden force. The spacecraft simply crossed the boundary. For Alexei, the moment passed almost unnoticed. But in that instant, something fundamental had changed. He was now inside the black hole. Behind him lay the event horizon, a border that could never again be crossed in the opposite direction. From this point forward, every possible path through space and time led only deeper toward the center. Returning was no longer physically possible. Even light could not escape. Outside the black hole, the universe continued its distant evolution, but none of it could ever reach him again. Alexei slowly turned his head and looked behind the spacecraft. For a moment, he could still see the distorted ring of the outside universe. But it looked strange now, compressed, fading. It was as if the entire cosmos had been squeezed into a shrinking circle of light. The rest of the sky was darkness, an endless abyss. The spacecraft continued falling.
But now the meaning of falling had changed. Inside the event horizon, the geometry of space and time becomes distorted in ways that human intuition cannot easily grasp. The center of the black hole, the singularity, was no longer just a destination in space. It was a destination in time. Just as every person on Earth inevitably moves forward toward tomorrow, Alexei was now inevitably moving toward the singularity. There was no way to stop it. No engine powerful enough.
No maneuver possible. The future had only one direction: down. The instruments began displaying new gravitational readings. The tidal forces were growing rapidly now. The difference between the gravitational pull at the front and back of the spacecraft was becoming extreme. The structure of the ship began to creak softly. Alexei looked at the readings. The process scientists called spaghettification had begun, and it would only become stronger the deeper he fell. But something even stranger was happening outside the ship. The remaining light from the universe behind him was growing brighter, bluer, more energetic. This was gravitational blue shift. As the light from the outside universe fell into the black hole behind him, its energy increased dramatically. Soon, that light would become intense radiation, then gamma rays. Eventually, it would fade completely, leaving only darkness. Alexei looked forward again. Ahead lay the deepest mystery in physics, the singularity, a point where gravity becomes infinite, where the known laws of physics collapse, where space and time themselves may cease to exist. And now, there was nothing left to stop the journey. The spacecraft continued its silent descent into the heart of the black hole. Inside the black hole, the universe no longer behaved the way humans expected. Alexei sat silently in the pilot's chair, watching the readings on the ship's instruments. Outside the window, the familiar sky of stars had almost completely vanished. What little remained of the outside universe was now compressed into a small, distorted circle of light far behind the spacecraft. It looked less like the night sky and more like a distant portal slowly closing. Everything else was darkness. But it was not an ordinary darkness. It was the kind of darkness that felt heavy, as if space itself had thickened around the ship. Inside the event horizon, the geometry of reality had fundamentally changed. In normal space, A person can move in many directions: forward, backward, left, right. But inside a black hole, those freedoms begin to disappear. All paths now led toward one place: the singularity. For Alexei, it was a strange idea to accept. No matter what he did, no matter how powerful the engines were, there was no way to avoid the center. It wasn't simply a location anymore. It was the future. Just as time on Earth always moves toward tomorrow, inside the black hole, every possible future pointed toward the singularity. The ship's navigation computer confirmed it. Escape velocity now exceeded the speed of light, which meant escape was no longer physically possible. Even if the engines suddenly became infinitely powerful, they could not overcome the geometry of space itself. Alexei stared at the data scrolling across the screen. Gravitational forces were increasing steadily, but something far stranger was happening to the surrounding space. The sensors began showing unusual distortions in the structure of space-time. Outside the ship, space itself appeared to stretch. Stars that had once been visible behind him were now pulled into thin lines of light before fading completely. Even the faint glow of distant galaxies was disappearing. The outside universe was slowly being erased from view. The ship continued to fall deeper, and as it did, the tidal forces became stronger. At first, the structure of the spacecraft simply groaned under the pressure. Then the hull began to flex. The front of the ship was now experiencing noticeably stronger gravity than the rear. This difference grew with every passing second. Inside the cabin, Alexei noticed a subtle but unsettling sensation. His body felt slightly heavier. Not in the normal way gravity feels on Earth.
It was more like being gently stretched. The difference was still small. The ship's structural systems were compensating for most of the stress. But the instruments confirmed what was happening.
The process of spaghettification was accelerating. Near a small black hole, this process would happen almost instantly. But this black hole was supermassive, which meant the stretching would happen gradually, terrifyingly gradually. Alexei looked forward into the darkness ahead. There was still nothing visible. No surface, no center, just endless blackness. Yet the sensors showed that the singularity was getting closer, and something strange began to appear on the ship's visual displays, faint patterns in the darkness. At first they looked like random distortions, but the longer Alexei watched, the more complex they seemed. Light itself was beginning to behave in strange ways. Inside the black hole, photons from the outside universe were being bent, twisted, and redirected along impossible paths. Some of that light was now circling around the spacecraft. The navigation camera briefly captured an impossible sight. Alexei saw the back of his own ship from the front window. It lasted only a moment before the image vanished again, but the explanation was clear. Inside the extreme curvature of space-time, light could loop around the ship in warped trajectories. In theory, it was possible to see multiple images of the same object from different angles at the same time. The universe had become a hall of mirrors, except the mirrors were made of gravity. Alexei leaned forward slightly, watching the displays. His breathing had slowed, not from fear, from awe. Every second revealed something no human mind had ever witnessed. Every observation was rewriting centuries of theoretical physics. But deeper inside the black hole, the situation was changing rapidly. The gravitational gradient continued to grow. The hull of the spacecraft began to vibrate. The structural integrity system activated automatically, reinforcing the frame. But the numbers were climbing faster now. The difference in gravity between the nose and the tail of the ship had increased dramatically. Several warning lights flickered across the console. Alexei ran a quick analysis. According to the calculations, the stretching forces would soon begin affecting everything inside the ship as well. Not just the hull. Everything. The air, the equipment, his own body. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. Another anomaly appeared on the sensors. Time itself was behaving unpredictably. In normal space, time flows smoothly and uniformly. Inside the black hole, that rule seemed to be breaking down. Certain readings suggested that different parts of the spacecraft were experiencing slightly different rates of time. The front of the ship was closer to the singularity, where gravity was stronger, which meant time there was moving more slowly. The difference was still tiny, but it was measurable. Alexei stared at the numbers. It meant the ship was no longer experiencing a single unified timeline. Instead, different regions of the spacecraft were beginning to experience time differently. In extreme gravitational fields, space-time itself can stretch and twist in ways that make simple concepts like now almost meaningless. The ship continued its silent fall. And then, the last visible light from the outside universe disappeared. The circle of distant stars behind the spacecraft finally collapsed into darkness. For the first time since the beginning of the universe, Alexei was completely isolated from the cosmos. No light could reach him anymore. No signal could escape. He was deeper inside the black hole than any information had ever traveled. Outside the ship, the darkness thickened. Ahead lay the most mysterious point in all of physics, the singularity, a place where density becomes infinite, where gravity becomes absolute, where the known laws of physics simply stop working. The instruments estimated the remaining time before reaching it. Alexei read the numbers slowly. Only minutes remained. The ship continued to fall, and somewhere ahead in the infinite darkness, the center of the black hole waited. The spacecraft continued its descent. Inside the cabin, the quiet hum of the ship had been replaced by a low metallic strain. The structure of the vessel was beginning to protest under the unimaginable forces building around it.
Every second, the gravitational gradient increased. The black hole was no longer just pulling the ship downward. It was tearing space itself apart. Alexei watched the data streams scrolling across the main console. The numbers had reached values that no human experiment had ever measured before. The instruments struggled to keep up with the rapidly changing environment. The difference in gravity between the front and the back of the spacecraft had now become extreme. The nose of the ship was falling slightly faster than the tail. The hull stretched, not dramatically yet, but enough for the structural sensors to register constant deformation. This was the beginning of the final stage of tidal forces. Spaghettification was no longer a theoretical concept. It was happening. The ship's automated systems attempted to compensate, reinforcing internal supports and redistributing stress through the composite frame. But the computer knew what Alexei already understood. Nothing built by humans was meant to survive here. Yet strangely, the fall still felt calm. There was no violent shaking, no explosive pressure, just a slow, unstoppable stretching. Alexei glanced toward the forward observation window again. The darkness ahead had begun to change. At first, it looked like nothing more than subtle ripples, but as the ship continued deeper, those ripples became patterns. Space itself was beginning to distort in visible ways. The sensors were now detecting extreme curvature in space-time.
Gravity here was so intense that the geometry of space was no longer behaving like the flat universe humans were used to. Lines bent, distances warped, angles lost their meaning. In this region, the mathematics describing space-time began to approach infinity. The closer the ship moved toward the center, the stranger everything became. Alexei noticed another anomaly on the visual display. Flashes of light appeared briefly in the darkness ahead. Tiny sparks. They flickered for only fractions of a second before disappearing again. At first, he thought it might be a malfunction in the sensors, but the analysis quickly showed otherwise. The flashes were real. They were particles. Inside the extreme gravitational environment of the black hole, radiation from the outside universe had been dragged inward and compressed into unimaginable energy. Photons were colliding with particles in violent reactions. Even empty space was no longer empty. Quantum effects were beginning to dominate. The vacuum itself was fluctuating. In ordinary conditions, quantum fluctuations are tiny and almost impossible to observe. But here, near the singularity, those fluctuations could become enormous. The boundary between matter and energy was starting to blur. Alexei leaned closer to the console, fascinated. He realized he was now witnessing something no human had ever directly observed. The place where Einstein's theory of gravity collided with quantum physics. For more than a century, scientists had struggled to unite these two pillars of modern science. General relativity described gravity on cosmic scales. Quantum mechanics described the microscopic world of particles. But inside a black hole, both theories had to work at the same time, and no one fully understood how. The instruments continued recording data, but the readings were becoming increasingly chaotic. Certain calculations produced impossible results. Other equations diverged toward infinity. It was as if the mathematical language humans used to describe the universe was breaking apart. Alexei slowly exhaled. He understood what this meant. He had reached the boundary where physics itself begins to fail. Ahead lay the singularity, a point of infinite density, a point where space-time collapses into something no theory has yet explained. But something unexpected appeared on the sensors. The computer began detecting intense gravitational turbulence, not smooth gravity, not predictable curves, but violent distortions in space-time itself. Alexei frowned slightly as he studied the display. According to some theoretical models, the interior of a rotating black hole might contain something called a Cauchy horizon, a strange boundary deep inside the black hole where the structure of space-time becomes unstable. Beyond that horizon, predictions of physics completely break down. The sensors suggested the ship might be approaching that region now. Outside the ship, space-time began to behave like a storm. Invisible gravitational waves rippled through the darkness. The hull groaned again as new stresses appeared across the frame. Inside the cabin, Alexei felt the stretching more clearly now. His body was being pulled slightly toward the front of the ship. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. Every atom in his body was experiencing a different gravitational pull. The process of spaghettification was accelerating. The computer displayed a grim estimate. Structural integrity of the spacecraft would not hold much longer. Minutes, perhaps less. Alexei did not panic. He had always known this mission could only end one way. But before the end came, there was still one final mystery waiting ahead: the singularity. For decades, scientists had debated what it truly was. Was it a single point, a ring, a quantum structure, or something even stranger? Some theories suggested that singularities might not exist at all,
That quantum effects could prevent matter from collapsing into infinite density. Others proposed that black holes might contain tunnels through space-time, gateways to other regions of the universe, or perhaps entirely new universes. No one knew the truth, because nothing had ever returned from inside a black hole. Until now, all of those ideas were only speculation. But Alexei was closer to the answer than any human had ever been. The sensors began to scream warnings. Gravitational gradients were now reaching catastrophic levels. The hull of the spacecraft stretched further. The front section elongated under the immense pull of gravity. Metal groaned. Internal supports fractured. Alexei looked forward one last time. In the darkness ahead, something appeared. Not light, not matter, but a region where the instruments could no longer measure anything at all. Every reading collapsed into mathematical infinity. The singularity was near, and the final moments of the journey had begun. The spacecraft was no longer truly a spacecraft. Its long metallic body had begun to stretch under the relentless pull of gravity. The once perfectly engineered structure was slowly transforming into something thinner, longer, and more fragile. Panels creaked. Internal supports bent under stresses no material had ever been designed to endure. Alexei remained strapped in the pilot's chair, watching the last stable readings flicker across the console. He knew the ship was reaching its limits, but strangely, inside the cabin there was still no sudden chaos. The destruction of the ship was happening gradually, silently, as if the black hole itself preferred patience. Outside the observation window, the darkness had changed again. It was no longer empty. The sensors now detected something far more violent happening deep within the black hole. Extreme gravitational turbulence. Invisible waves of distorted space-time rippled outward from the center, passing through the falling spacecraft like slow cosmic tides. Every time one of those waves passed, the structure of the ship stretched further. Alexei's body felt the difference more clearly now. The gravitational pull on his feet was noticeably stronger than the pull on his head. It was still subtle, the kind of sensation that might almost feel like standing on a steep slope, but the instruments confirmed the truth. His body was beginning to elongate. Every atom inside him was being pulled slightly differently. The process of spaghettification had reached its irreversible stage. The computer estimated that the difference in gravitational force between the top and bottom of his body would soon become fatal. But before that moment arrived, something extraordinary happened. The darkness ahead flickered. At first, Alexei thought it was simply a sensor malfunction. But then the ship's visual system began detecting something impossible: structure. In the darkness near the center of the black hole, faint geometric distortions appeared. Not objects, not light, but patterns. It looked as if space-time itself had begun to fold. Alexei stared at the screen, hardly believing what he was seeing. The singularity was not behaving like a simple point. Instead, the instruments suggested something more complex, a swirling region where space-time twisted into impossible shapes. Some theoretical models had predicted this. In a rotating black hole, the singularity might not be a point at all. It could be a ring. A ring singularity, predicted by the mathematics of Kerr black holes. If that were true, then the center of the black hole might not simply destroy everything that reached it. There might be paths around it.
paths through warped space-time itself. Alexei's heart rate increased slightly as he studied the readings. According to one controversial theory, such a structure could create a tunnel through space-time, a wormhole.
A bridge connecting distant regions of the universe, or perhaps entirely different universes. For decades, scientists had debated whether such structures could exist in reality. Most believed they would collapse instantly. Others argued that the intense rotation of certain black holes might keep them open for brief moments. The sensors were now showing something extraordinary. Space-time near the center was twisting violently. The geometry of space was no longer behaving like anything humans had ever observed. Distances became meaningless. Directions blurred together. The ship's navigation computer struggled to map the environment because space itself no longer had a stable shape. Forward, backward, left, right. Those directions had lost their meaning. The singularity was now only seconds away. The structural integrity alarms screamed across the cabin. The front section of the spacecraft stretched dramatically as gravity intensified beyond all limits. Metal snapped. Internal compartments began collapsing one by one. Alexei could feel the stretching now. His legs were being pulled downward with increasing force. His spine elongated under the difference in gravity. Pain began to spread slowly through his body as the forces continued to grow. But his attention remained fixed on the instruments, because the sensors had detected something new. Beyond the twisted geometry of the singularity, there appeared to be another region of space-time, not empty, not destroyed, but structured, almost like a distant horizon. The computer struggled to interpret the data. The equations describing the region beyond the singularity did not collapse into infinity. Instead, they suggested something astonishing. A continuation of space-time, another region, another universe, or perhaps another part of the same universe, unimaginably far away. Alexei realized the possibility immediately. If the ring singularity truly formed a passage through space-time, then falling into a rotating black hole might not end in destruction. It might be a journey, a passage to somewhere else. But there was no time left to confirm it. The spacecraft's structure had finally reached its breaking point. The front section tore apart under the overwhelming gravitational forces. The cabin stretched violently as the rest of the ship disintegrated behind him. The instruments went dark one by one. Metal twisted into long, glowing strands as tidal forces ripped the spacecraft apart, and Alexei continued falling. The singularity filled the entire field of view now. Not a point, not a surface, but a swirling ring of infinite gravity. Space itself folded inward around it, time distorted beyond recognition. And in the final moments before the forces became too great for any human body to survive, Alexei saw something that no scientist had ever confirmed. Beyond the twisted ring of the singularity, space-time opened, like a doorway, a path leading somewhere beyond the black hole. And the last fragments of the falling spacecraft crossed the threshold. For a brief moment, everything stopped making sense. The violent stretching of space, the tearing metal, the unbearable forces, all of it vanished as suddenly as it had begun. The crushing pull of gravity that had dominated every second of the journey simply disappeared. Silence returned. Not the silence of empty space, something deeper, almost peaceful. For the first time since crossing the event horizon, there was no overwhelming gravitational strain. The terrible stretching forces that had torn the spacecraft apart had faded into nothing. Alexei no longer felt the pull that had dragged him relentlessly toward the center. The singularity was behind him. Or perhaps it had never truly been a destination at all. For centuries, scientists had imagined the singularity as the final point of destruction, the inevitable end of everything that entered a black hole. But what if that assumption had been wrong? What if the singularity was not an ending, but a transition? The darkness slowly began to change. At first, Alexei thought it might be the last flickers of his consciousness struggling against the impossible forces he had just experienced. But the light grew stronger. Not the harsh glare of a star, something softer,
A faint glow spread across the surrounding space, revealing something completely unexpected. Stars. But they were not the stars he had seen before. Their patterns were unfamiliar, their colors slightly different. Some burned with deep blue light, far brighter than any stars he had ever observed. Others glowed with unusual crimson hues that suggested entirely different chemical compositions. Galaxies stretched across the distance, massive spirals of light slowly rotating through the darkness. Nebulae drifted through space like enormous clouds of glowing dust. It was a universe, but not the one he had left behind. Alexei tried to orient himself. Fragments of the destroyed spacecraft floated nearby, slowly tumbling through the new cosmic landscape. The navigation computer had been destroyed. The instruments were gone, but the evidence was all around him. The black hole had not destroyed him. It had transported him. A bridge through space-time, a tunnel connecting distant regions of the cosmos. Or perhaps something even stranger, another universe entirely. Theoretical physicists had once proposed such ideas. According to some models of rotating black holes, the ring singularity might form a passage, a kind of cosmic gateway, a wormhole. Most scientists believed such structures would collapse instantly. Others thought the journey through them would destroy any matter attempting to pass. Yet here he was, drifting through unfamiliar space, alive. But something strange happened as he continued floating through the silent cosmic void. Time felt different, not just slower.
Not faster, different. Moments seemed to stretch and overlap. Memories of the journey through the black hole felt distant and immediate at the same time. It was as if the rules governing time itself had changed. Perhaps this universe had different physical laws, or perhaps the journey through the singularity had altered his perception of time. Alexei looked around at the strange new stars. For the first time since leaving Earth, he realized something extraordinary. No human had ever been here before. Every civilization in the history of humanity had existed within a tiny corner of the cosmos, the solar system, the Milky Way, one galaxy among hundreds of billions. But the black hole had opened a path beyond those boundaries, a doorway to the unknown. If humanity ever learned to control such passages, the entire universe, or perhaps countless universes, could become reachable. But Alexei also understood something else. No signal could ever reach Earth from here. The event horizon had sealed the path behind him forever. Everything he had witnessed, the warping of time, the collapse of space-time, the passage beyond the singularity, would remain unknown to the civilization that had sent him. Humanity would continue studying black holes through telescopes and equations. They would continue debating theories, arguing about what lay beyond the horizon, never knowing that one man had already crossed that boundary and discovered the answer. Alexei slowly turned his gaze toward the distant galaxies of this new universe. Somewhere out there might be planets, stars, perhaps even life. The journey into the black hole had not been the end. It had been the beginning of a new exploration, a new cosmos waiting to be understood. And as Alexei drifted through the silent ocean of unfamiliar stars, one thought quietly formed in his mind. For the first time in human history, someone had gone beyond the edge of the universe.